What would you do if the only thing your father left you was a patch of cracked ground that every man in town called worthless Marin Holloway was left exactly that? 160 acres of sun-scorched clay and bitter sage out beyond the dry wash, the kind of land that swallowed a man's hopes faster than it swallowed his sweat. The folks of Coyote Bend, Wyoming, called it the Cinder Flats, and they laughed when they said the name because laughing was easier than facing what the country had done to better men before her. But what those folks did not know, what they could not have guessed as she stepped down from the stagecoach that hot June morning in 1889, was that her father, a quiet cartographer who had spent his life listening to the deep music of stone, had left her one other thing: a heavy oak trunk bound in tarnished brass. And inside that trunk, beneath the maps and the rolled parchments and the journals written in a code only the dead could read, lay a truth that would crack open the valley like an egg and rewrite the future of every soul who lived there. Stay close and let us know where you are watching from as we uncover the secret buried deep beneath the dust of the Cinder Flats. The stagecoach groaned into Coyote Bend under a white, merciless sun, dragging behind it a long plume of alkali dust that hung in the still air like the ghost of weather. Marin Holloway stepped down onto the hard-packed street and felt the weight of the place settle on her shoulders, heavier than the carpet bag in her hand, heavier than the 10 years she had been gone. The town looked smaller than she remembered. The same weathered plank buildings leaned against each other like old men sharing a secret. The same tin signs creaked on rusted hinges above doors that had been painted and repainted until the wood beneath had forgotten its own grain. A dog lay panting in a sliver of shade beneath the boardwalk, watching her with eyes that held no curiosity, only the dull patience of a creature that had seen everything come and everything go. She was 25 years old. She had left this place when she was 15, a girl with ink-stained fingers and a chest full of grievances, bound for a teaching position in a green and civilized town back east in Pennsylvania, a world away from this raw and unfinished country. She had built a life there of sorts. A small rented room above a milliner's shop. A schoolhouse with 32 children whose names she had memorized in a single afternoon. An engagement to a banker's son who had decided 3 weeks before the wedding that he preferred a woman with a softer disposition and a quieter mind. She had come home because there was nowhere else to go. The telegram had been brief and brutal, the way telegrams always were when they carried bad news across long distances. Father passed. Effects held. Come at once. Dunmore. She had read it twice and then folded it into the smallest square her fingers could make, as if making it small would make it less true. A few townspeople lingered in the slivers of shade along the boardwalk, watching her with the particular kind of attention that small towns reserve for prodigal daughters. She recognized some of the faces, though time had thickened them, lined them, hollowed them out. Old Mrs. Pettigrew from the milliners. The Sutton brothers, who had been boys when she left, and were now men with sun-creased eyes and tobacco-stained mustaches. None of them spoke. None of them stepped forward to welcome her home. She lifted her bag and walked. The lawyer's office sat above the mercantile, reached by a narrow staircase that smelled of dust and old varnish. The door at the top bore a brass plate that read, "Dunmore Attorney at Law," in letters that had been polished so often the metal beneath had begun to wear thin. Marin knocked once and let herself in. Mr. Dunmore was a small man in a black coat, too heavy for the season, with skin the color of bone china and hair so thin she could count the strands. He rose when she entered, gestured her toward a chair, and did not quite meet her eyes. "Miss Holloway, my condolences." "Thank you." He cleared his throat. He shuffled papers on his desk that did not need shuffling. He poured her a glass of water from a pitcher and set it before her with a hand that trembled very slightly. And she understood, looking at him, that this was a man who was about to tell her something he did not want to say. "Your father's affairs," he began, "were straightforward in the legal sense. He had little in the way of currency. No accounts at the bank in Cheyenne. No outstanding debts." He paused. He held title to a parcel of land, 160 acres south of the dry wash. The deed is here. He slid a folder across the desk. Marin opened it. Inside was a single document, the paper yellowed at the edges, the legal description rendered in the spidery hand of a territorial clerk. Section 23, Township 14, South Range, 31 East. And beneath that, in her father's own writing, the words he had given the place. The Cinder Flats. She knew the name. Everyone in the valley knew the name. The Cinder Flats was the joke that the country told on itself, a stretch of cracked clay and thorn scrub where nothing grew and nothing lived and nothing ever would. Her father had bought it, the gossip used to go, because no one else was fool enough to want it. "There is also," Dunmore said, "a trunk from his workshop. I had it brought to the livery for safekeeping. Mr. Pike has been holding it." She nodded. She closed the folder. She started to rise. "Miss Holloway." She paused. Dunmore was looking at his hands now, at the pale, knotted fingers laced together on the desk. He spoke without lifting his head. "There was an offer on the land some months before your father passed. A standing offer, $800 in gold." Marin sat back down. $800, she repeated. "Your father declined, repeatedly. The gentleman in question was, I would say, persistent." "Who?" Dunmore looked up at her then, and she saw the calculation in his face, the weighing of what he was permitted to say against what he believed she had the right to know. "Mr. Beaumont Drexler," he said quietly. She held his gaze. She thought of the Cinder Flats, the laughingstock of the valley, the worthless patch of nothing that her father had refused to sell for $800 in gold. She thought of what $800 in gold could buy a man in this country. A house, a herd, a future. Why, she said, would a man like Beaumont Drexler want a piece of land that nobody wants? Dunmore lowered his eyes again. That, Miss Holloway, is a question I am not able to answer. She walked out of the office into the white blade of the afternoon sun, and the question went with her, and it would not leave her side for a long time after. The livery stable stood at the south end of the street, a long, low building of weathered cedar that smelled of hay and leather and the warm, honest breath of horses. Wendell Pike was forking dirty straw out of a stall when she came in. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders and slow through the joints, with a face that had been carved by 60 Wyoming winters into something kind and unhurried. He had been her father's closest friend, the only one she could remember. And when he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, his eyes went soft. "Marin," he said. He set the fork against the wall and walked toward her, and she let him fold her into an embrace that smelled of hay and pipe smoke, and a familiar masculine warmth she had not known she was missing. He held her at arm's length and studied her face. "You look like him," he said, "around the eyes. He'd be glad to know that." She tried to smile. She did not quite manage it. "Mr. Dunmore said you have the trunk." "I do, and something else besides." He led her down the long center aisle of the stable past stalls, where the horses turned their dark, patient faces to watch her go by. At the far end, in a clean corner near a window that let in a square of dusty light, sat an oak trunk bound in tarnished brass. It was larger than she had expected. The wood darkened by years and used the brass softened to the green of old pond water. A relic of some earlier life her father had lived before he came to this country, before he became the man she had known and not known. "He kept it locked," Wendell said, "but the key is here." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a small iron key worn smooth by handling. He pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers around it. "Now then," he said, "there's the other thing." He led her to the last stall on the right and opened the gate. Inside stood a mare the color of dust, gray and dappled, her muzzle gone white with age. Her dark eyes turning toward Marin with the slow, grave attention of a creature that has lived long enough to take its time about things. She was thin in the way old horses get thin, but her coat was clean and her hooves were trimmed, and someone had taken care of her. "Her name's Penny," Wendell said. "She was your father's. He rode her every day of the last 6 years of his life. I've kept her fed since he passed, but she belongs to you now. He'd want it that way." Marin stepped into the stall. The mare did not move. Marin placed her hand on the warm, sloping plane of Penny's neck, and the mare let out a long, slow breath that fluttered the dust on the stall floor, and Marin felt something in her chest crack open very quietly. "He was a good rider," Wendell said behind her. His voice had changed. It had gone low and careful the way a man's voice goes when he is choosing his words. Your father, he was the best rider I ever knew. He could sit a horse the way other men sit a chair. He could ride through country a mountain goat would think twice about. Marin did not turn around. She kept her hand on the mare's neck. Mr. Pike. Wendell. Wendell, how did my father die? A long silence. The mare shifted her weight from one foreleg to the other. Somewhere down the aisle, a horse snorted softly. They found him, Wendell said, down by Bitterroot Creek, about 4 miles east of his cabin. His neck was broken. They said he fell. They said that. And what do you say? Another silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice was very quiet. I say there's a question I've been carrying for 4 months, Marin, and I'd rather not say it out loud just yet, not until you've had a chance to look at what's in that trunk. There's things in there I don't understand, things he never showed me. Maybe they'll make sense to you. Maybe they won't. But I'd ask you to look at them before I tell you what I think happened to your father. Will you do that for me? She turned then. She looked at him. The old man's face was steady, but his eyes were not, and she understood that whatever he was holding back was costing him something to hold. Yes, she said. I'll look. He nodded once. He laid a heavy hand on her shoulder for a moment and then took it away. There's a room out back, he said, behind the stable, clean, quiet. You can stay there as long as you need. I'll have the trunk brought in. She thanked him. She walked out of the stable into the late afternoon, and the question Dunmore had refused to answer, and the question Wendell had refused to ask, both walked beside her, and she could feel them at her shoulders like 2 patient ghosts. She did not make it to the room before she met Beaumont Drexler. She had stopped at the mercantile to buy what she needed for the night. Flour, salt, coffee, a tin of beans. The air inside was thick with the smells of dry goods and pipe tobacco, and the particular dust that gathers in places where men gather to talk. A pot-bellied stove sat cold in the center of the room, and around it on barrels and crates, and a single battered chair sat 6 men in conversation. The talk died when she walked in. She knew him at once. He was a large man, the kind of large that announces itself before he speaks. He wore a coat of dark gray wool too fine for the country he lived in, and a vest of cream silk under it, and a watch chain of yellow gold that caught the light when he moved. His face was broad and ruddy, his beard close trimmed and silvered at the chin. His eyes, the pale blue of glacial water. He sat on a barrel near the stove, with one boot crossed over the other knee, and when Marin walked in, he uncrossed them slowly and stood. Miss Holloway. She nodded to him. She moved to the counter and laid her list before the storekeeper, a thin man named Halsey, who had been thin and named Halsey for as long as she could remember. Halsey began assembling her order without speaking. Drexler crossed the room. He did not hurry. He never hurried. He walked the way he sat, the way he spoke, the way he did everything with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never in his life been told to wait. He stopped beside her at the counter and placed his hands on the wood-large hands, manicured hands, with a gold band on the left fourth finger and a heavy silver ring on the right. "My condolences," he said. "Your father was a remarkable man." "Thank you. I knew him some years ago. We were associated for a time." She turned her head and looked at him then, and she saw something move behind those pale blue eyes. A small, careful adjustment, as if a hand had reached up and straightened a curtain she had not been meant to see behind. "Associated," she said. "In a business capacity, surveys, land assessments. Your father had a remarkable eye for country. There are things he could see in a piece of ground that no other man in this territory could see. It was a privilege to work with him." She said nothing. She watched him. "I wonder," Drexler said, and his voice took on the conspiratorial warmth of a man offering charity, "if I might be of service. I understand your father left you a parcel of land south of the dry wash, the cinder flats." "He did. It is, I am sorry to say, not a productive piece of country. I have neighboring holdings. I run cattle east of the wash, and I would find it useful to control the access through that section. Out of respect for your father and out of consideration for your circumstances, I would be willing to take the parcel off your hands, $25, in cash, today." The room behind them had gone very quiet. Marin did not look around, but she could feel the attention of every man in the place gathered on her shoulders like a coat. $25. The same land for which he had offered her father $800. She thought about that. She thought about it for a long, careful moment while Halsey wrapped her flower in brown paper and tied it with twine. Then she lifted her eyes to Beaumont Drexler's face and held them there. "Mr. Drexler," she said, "it is not for sale." A small smile moved across his mouth. It did not reach his eyes. "Miss Holloway, with respect, you have been away a long time. You may not appreciate the realities of this country. A young woman alone with no income, no resources, no knowledge of the land, attempting to make her way on a parcel that has defeated men twice her size and 3 times her experience. I am offering you the means of a graceful departure. A stagecoach ticket to anywhere you would rather be. A small sum to begin a new life. There is no shame in accepting such an offer. There is, I would suggest, a great deal of shame in refusing it out of pride." He let the words sit. He let them work. Marin paid Halsey for her goods. She gathered the parcels into her arms. She turned to face Beaumont Drexler fully. "I have heard your offer," she said, and my answer is no. She walked past him toward the door. She did not look back, but as she reached the threshold, she heard behind her the soft scrape of his boot on the plank floor as he turned to follow her with his eyes. And in that small sound, she heard something she had not heard in his voice. Not anger, not amusement, patience. The patience of a man who has decided to wait. The room behind the livery was small but clean, with a narrow rope bed and a washstand and a single window that looked east toward the high country. Wendell had built a fire in the small iron stove against the wall, and the room was warm with the good warm smell of burning pine. The trunk sat in the corner where two of Wendell's stable hands had set it down. It looked larger inside the small room than it had looked in the stable, as if the close walls were uncertain whether they could hold it. Marin ate a small supper of bread and cold ham. She washed her hands and her face. She lit the kerosene lantern on the washstand and set it on the floor beside the trunk. Then she knelt down with the iron key in her hand, and after a long, still moment in which she found she was almost afraid to open it, she fitted the key to the lock and turned it. The lid came up with a small, dry sigh. The smell that rose out of the trunk was not the smell she had expected. She had expected the smell of the sea because the brass had the green of sea air. But the trunk did not smell of salt. It smelled of dust, of dry pine, of old paper. It smelled of her father. Inside the trunk was packed nearly to the brim with rolled parchments, dozens of them tied with twine, and arranged with the careful precision of a man who had spent his life caring for paper. On top of the rolls lay 3 leather-bound journals, their covers worn soft from handling, their spines cracked from use. And beneath the journals, set carefully in a small velvet-lined recess in the lid, lay a tin-type photograph in a brass frame. Marin lifted the photograph out first. It was the smaller version of a portrait, the kind made by a traveling photographer who set up a tent in the back lot of a saloon and charged $2 a likeness. The image had darkened with time, but the figures were still clear. 2 men stood side by side in front of a painted backdrop of mountains. The man on the left was her father. Cassius Holloway, in a younger and harder version, perhaps 35 years old, with a dark beard and the same calm, watchful eyes she remembered. The man on the right she did not recognize at first. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, clean-shaven in this image. His hair dark and parted in the middle. His arm was thrown around her father's shoulders in the easy, familiar way of brothers. And both men were smiling the way men smile who have just come down off a mountain together and shared a flask of whiskey at the top. She lifted the photograph closer to the lantern. The man on the right was Beaumont Drexler, younger, leaner, clean-shaven, but the same pale blue eyes, the same broad, easy face, the same gold watch chain glinting at the vest pocket, though in this image the suit was rougher and the boots were trail boots, and his arm rested on Cassius Holloway's shoulder, the way a man's arm rests on the shoulder of someone he loves. Marin sat back on her heels. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she set it aside, carefully face up on the floorboards where the lantern light could touch it, and she reached for the journals. The first journal was filled with field notes, survey readings, bearings, elevations, geological observations rendered in her father's elegant, precise hand. She turned the pages slowly, understanding very little, recognizing only that she was looking at the careful daily work of a man who had loved his profession the way other men love their wives. There were sketches of rock formations, cross-sections of valleys, notations of mineral content in a shorthand she could not read. At the bottom of one page, she found a small drawing of a hawk in flight made in the margin, as if her father had paused in his work to look up and notice the day. The second journal was different. It began with maps. Not maps of any place she knew. Maps that were not maps. Maps that seemed to depict the inside of the country, the parts beneath the surface, the parts no eye could ever see. Strata of stone laid down in the time before time. Faults and fractures. The slow movements of water through rock, and running through them, the faint, impossible blue lines that ran across the parchments in the trunk. The same blue lines drawn in the same patient hand, traced as if her father had been able to see beneath the skin of the world and was trying to write down what he saw. At the bottom of one of these pages, in his small, elegant script, were 2 words. Aqua dormiens, the sleeping water. The third journal she could not read. It was filled page after page with symbols she did not recognize. Some looked like the shorthand of a geologist. Some looked like nothing she had ever seen. Her father had built himself a private language in the last years of his life, and he had written down the things that mattered most to him in a script that only he could understand. Marin sat with the third journal open on her lap and looked at the photograph on the floor. 2 men smiling, 2 men who had once been friends. She picked up the photograph again and turned it over. On the back in pencil in her father's hand was a small inscription. H&B D Bitterroot Survey. Summer of 1877. 12 years ago. 12 years ago, when she had been 13, and her father had been a man who came home in the evening smelling of pine smoke and trail dust, when she had not yet learned to slam doors at him, when there had still been time. 12 years ago, her father and Beaumont Drexler had stood together on a mountain somewhere and laughed for a camera. She thought of the man at the mercantile counter. $25, the unhurried smile. She thought of Dunmore's careful voice. $800 in gold. She thought of Wendell, his hand on her shoulder. There's a question I've been carrying for 4 months. She set the photograph back in its velvet recess. She closed the trunk. She did not sleep well that night, and the dreams she had were of running water far below the floorboards, a sound she could feel more than hear, a low, patient hum coming up through the bones of the earth and into the bones of her body. And when she woke at the first gray light of dawn, she lay for a long while without moving, listening to a silence that did not feel like silence anymore. She bought the buckboard from Wendell at a fair price and hitched Penny to it on a morning 2 days later, when she had finished gathering the supplies she would need. Flour and beans and coffee, a side of bacon wrapped in oilcloth, a small iron skillet, a coil of rope, 2 water barrels filled at the town pump lashed in the bed of the wagon, the trunk riding behind the seat covered with a piece of canvas against the dust. The town watched her leave. They watched without comment the men on the boardwalk, the women in the doorways of their shops. Old Mrs. Pettigrew stood at the window of the milliner's with a small handkerchief pressed to her mouth as if she were watching a funeral procession. The Sutton brothers smoked in the shade of the smithy and turned their heads to follow the wagon as it passed. No one waved. No one called out. She passed the last building on the south end of the street, a small adobe house with a shaded porch, and on the bench beside the door sat an old man with a piece of cottonwood in one hand and a small, bone-handled knife in the other. He was very old. His face was the color of saddle leather, and his hair was the color of ash, and he did not look up as she drew near. His knife moved across the wood with the slow, inevitable motion of a thing that had been doing what it was doing for a long time. She did not know him. She had been a girl when she left, and he had not lived here then. But as she drew abreast of him, his voice came to her on the morning air, dry as the rustle of cottonwood leaves on a stone roof. Your father listened to the stone's memory, the old man said, not looking up. She reined Penny in. You have his eyes, he said. See if you have his ears. She waited. He did not look up. He did not say more. His knife went on with its small, slow work, and after a long moment, she clucked her tongue at Penny, and the mare moved on, and the old man and his porch fell behind, and the words went with her into the country. The road dwindled, first to a wide rutted track, then to a pair of faint lines worn into the dirt by a few patient wheels, then to nothing at all. The country opened around her in long pale folds, the sagebrush giving way to greasewood, the greasewood thinning to thorny mesquite, the soil turning by slow degrees from the gray of dust to the pale cracked clay of the country her father had called the Cinder Flats. The sun climbed and stood overhead and beat the land flat. There was no shade anywhere. There was no sound but the slow creak of the wagon and the patient rhythm of Penny's hooves and the wind when it came in the dry, brittle scrub. She had been riding 3 hours when she heard the hoofbeats behind her. She did not turn. She kept her hands loose on the reins, and her eyes between Penny's twitching ears, and the hoofbeats grew louder and louder, the rhythm of a horse ridden hard, and then the rider came up alongside her in a billow of dust and reined in his mount with the easy authority of a man who had reined in many things in his life. It was Beaumont Drexler. His stallion was a black animal, 16 hands at the withers, glossy as fresh ink lathered now along the chest from the run. Drexler sat the horse the way wealthy men sit horses lightly and well, his gloved hands resting on the pommel. He tipped his wide-brimmed hat to her with the exaggerated politeness of a man who has come to make a point. Miss Holloway. She did not slow Penny. She did not look at him. Enjoying your inheritance. She did not answer. He let his stallion fall into pace beside the wagon. He rode in silence for a long minute, watching her with his pale eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. It had lost the false cordiality of the mercantile. It had gone quieter, lower. I am going to say something to you, Miss Holloway, not as a businessman, as a man who has lived in this country a long time. There are pieces of land out here that take more than they give. The Cinder Flats is one of them. It took your father in the end. Whatever he thought he was doing out here, whatever he was looking for, the country took him before he found it. I do not say this to hurt you. I say it because I believe your father would have wanted you to know it. She held the reins. She did not look at him. You loved my father, Mr. Drexler. A small silence. I knew him. You knew him well. I knew him as well as any man knew him. Then you will understand, she said, why I am going to see the land my father left me. He looked at her then. She felt his eyes on the side of her face like the touch of cold water. She did not turn. After a long moment, he gathered the reins of the black stallion and lifted them and clucked once very softly, and the horse leapt forward into a canter, and then a gallop, and a billow of dust rose up and enveloped her, and the wagon, and the old mare, and through it she heard Drexler's voice come back to her on the wind. This country has a way of swallowing people who do not respect it, Miss Holloway, and the Cinder Flats has no respect for anyone. The dust settled. He was gone. She rode on. She reached it in the late afternoon, when the sun was 3 fingers above the western mountains, and the light had begun to slant, and the shadows of the thorn scrub stretched long across the cracked clay. A single weathered post stood at the edge of the parcel, sun-bleached almost white, the wood split and silvered by years. Carved into the post in the same elegant, precise hand she had been reading in the journals for 2 nights were 2 letters. C.H. Marin reined Penny in and sat for a long moment, looking at the post and at the country beyond it. It was worse than she had imagined. The ground was a mosaic of deep sun-baked cracks. A parched and broken skin stretched over the bones of an old dry country. The only vegetation was the scattering of skeletal thorny bushes and the occasional clump of bitterbrush gray and defeated, leaning into a wind that had stopped blowing hours ago. In the rough center of the parcel stood a cabin, or what had been a cabin, a small square of weathered cedar with a sagging roofline and a door that hung from one leather hinge and swung listlessly in the still air. The chimney had collapsed at its mouth. One window was a black hole where the glass had long ago gone to wherever broken glass goes in country like this. It was the picture of perfect desolation. For a long moment, Marin sat on the wagon seat with the reins loose in her hands, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her that she could turn around. She could turn the wagon. She could drive back to Coyote Bend and find Beaumont Drexler and put the deed in his hand and take whatever he was willing to give her and ride east on the first stagecoach and never come back. She could do that. No one would blame her. No one in the world would say she had been wrong. Then Penny, who had stood patiently through all of it, lowered her gray muzzle and began to nibble at a stalk of dry grass beside the trail post. The simple, stubborn act of survival. Marin let out a long breath she had not known she was holding. She climbed down from the wagon. She walked to Penny's head and laid her hand on the mare's warm neck and stood for a moment in the dying afternoon light, with her hand on the only thing in this country that she could call her own. "All right," she said. "All right, Penny, let's see what he left us." She made her camp not in the cabin which she could not yet bring herself to enter, but a little way off, in the lee of the wagon, where she built a small fire from the dead wood of a long-gone mesquite. She unhitched Penny and led her to a patch of slightly less forbidding ground and set out a measure of oats from the sack and a bucket of water from the barrel. She ate a small supper of bread and jerky sitting on the wagon tongue with the trunk open beside her and one of her father's strange, beautiful maps unrolled on her knees. The sun went down behind the western mountains and took the heat of the day with it. The desert cooled. The colors of the country deepened the pale clay, turning rose and then violet and then a deep velvet gray. The stars came out one by one, and then all at once a brilliant, teeming river of light arching across a sky of pure black, more stars than any town-dwelling soul could imagine. The stars her father had spent his life riding under. She let the fire burn down. She let the night come. And she sat there in the dark with the map on her knees and the great silence of the country pressing in around her. And for the first time since she had stepped off the stagecoach in Coyote Bend, she felt something in her chest that was not grief and was not anger and was not loss. It was something older and quieter. It was the small, steady ember of curiosity, the ember her father had tried to fan in her when she was a girl, when she had been too proud and too angry to let it catch. It was catching now. It was catching here in the dark in the country he had loved beside the trunk he had left her. She slept in the wagon bed wrapped in a wool blanket. She slept badly. The dreams came again, the low resonant hum running deep, deep underground. The sound that was not a sound, but a vibration she could feel in her bones. And somewhere in the dream, her father was speaking to her in his own voice. And she could almost hear him, and then she woke. It was the gray hour before dawn. The world was held in that strange suspended moment when the night has begun to leave and the day has not yet arrived. The air was perfectly still. A faint, cold blue light lay across the country. She sat up in the wagon bed, and a small jolt of fear went through her. Penny was gone. She had tethered the mare to the wagon. She had checked the knot. The lead rope still hung from the wagon ring, but the other end had been worked loose, or chewed loose, or unfastened by some patient, gentle mouth, and the mare was not there. Marin swung her legs over the side of the wagon, and her bare feet touched the cool dust of the ground. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the half-light. She saw the mare. Penny was standing in what looked to be the exact center of the parcel. Not grazing, not sleeping. Her head was down, almost touching the ground. Her body was rigid with attention. Her ears were swiveled forward, then back, then forward again, aimed not at any horizon, not at any sound, but at the dust beneath her hooves. She looked for all the world like a creature listening. Marin walked toward her slowly. The cold of the night still lay in the ground, and the soles of her feet were quickly numb against it. She did not call to the mare. She did not want to break whatever it was the mare was inside of. She came up beside Penny and stopped. The mare did not look at her. The ears did not move. The breath came soft and slow. Marin looked at the ground. It looked no different from any other piece of ground on the cinder flats. The same pale cracked clay, the same scattering of thorn shadow. She knelt. She held her palm a few inches above the surface, the way her father had once held his palm above a granite outcrop on a high ridge 13 years ago. She felt nothing, no vibration, no warmth, no change. She was about to stand. Then the first direct rays of the rising sun cut across the country from behind her low and slanting, and the long, angled light fell across the ground at her feet, and the world beneath her hand became suddenly and beautifully strange. She saw them. Not the broad, ugly cracks of the sun-baked clay, the cracks every fool could see, but a network of incredibly fine hairline fissures, no wider than a thread, no deeper than a thought, that the sideways light had brought up out of the dust. They radiated outward from a central point directly beneath Penny's hooves, branching and branching again, a delicate, intricate pattern like the veins of a leaf. like the structure of a snowflake, like the diagram of something alive. Order in a country defined by chaos. A design where there should have been only dirt. Her breath caught. She looked up at the mare. The mare was looking down at her. Marin stayed there on her knees for a long time with the cold dust against her shins and the rising sun warming her shoulders and the impossible pattern of lines branching out beneath her hand until at last she made herself stand and walk back to the wagon. Her legs felt strange beneath her. The dust on her hands was somehow no longer ordinary dust. She built up the fire. She made coffee. She drank it slowly, watching the mare who had at last lifted her head and begun to walk away from the place she had stood, as if released from a duty she had performed. It was after she had eaten, after she had washed her tin cup, after she had begun to think she could perhaps face the cabin, now that she did the thing that changed everything. She went to the cabin. She pushed open the groaning door and stepped inside, and the dust of years lifted around her in slow drifting clouds, and the smell of the place was the smell of abandonment and old wood, and the small, soft scuttle of mice in the rafters. There was a broken chair, a rusted tin cup on a shelf, a scattering of dry mouse droppings on the plank floor. The roof had failed in one corner, and a shaft of new morning sun came down through the gap and lit a square of the floor as bright as a stage. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. She walked the small room slowly. She touched the chair. She touched the cold iron of the wood stove. She lifted the tin cup and set it back down. She moved to the corner where her father had kept his work table, and the table was gone, but the wall behind it was not gone, and on the wall, tacked at the corners, with small square nails, was a single large sheet of vellum. A map. It was a map of this very parcel. The cinder flats, rendered in her father's hand, unfinished. He had been working on it when he died. She stepped closer. There was a faint line drawn across the floor of the cabin in pencil, the kind of line a man draws when he is laying out where something is, when he is marking what he knows to himself in a way that no one else will ever need to read. The line ran from a point on the wall map across the floor to the wall opposite where it ended at the baseboard. Marin followed it with her eyes. She knelt. The baseboard had been pried up at one corner. The nails had been removed and replaced, but the small dark shadows of the removal were there if a person knew to look. She slid her fingernails under the edge and lifted. The board came up easily. Beneath it was a small hollow in the floor, no larger than the palm of her hand. And in the hollow lay a folded square of paper. Marin lifted it out. She unfolded it slowly. The paper was thin and creased, and it had been folded for a long time. The hand on it was her father's. The ink was a little faded, but the words were clear. Marin, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have come home, and you have done the one thing I prayed you would do. You have looked at the land. You have looked inside the trunk. You have learned to ask questions. Listen to me now, daughter, because I have very little time and very few words. My death will be called an accident. It will not have been an accident. The man who paid you the visit you have surely had by now is the man who has reason to want me silent. I will not write his name on this paper, because if this paper falls into the wrong hands, I do not wish to confirm what he already fears. There is a night you must ask about, the night of the 14th of March. Ask Wendell. He will tell you what he knows. He will not tell you what he suspects until you ask him. He is a careful man, and I love him for it. Trust the maps. Trust the mare. Trust the old man on the porch with the cottonwood. They are the only 3 witnesses I have left you. I am sorry, Marin. I am sorry for the years between us. I was not a good father. I was a man who heard the music of stone more clearly than the voice of his own child, and I have lived to know the cost of that. And now I do not have time to make it right. But you are here. You are here, and you are reading this. And that is a beginning. Listen to the country. Listen the way I taught you to listen, even though you would not let me teach you. There is a river under the land, Marin. There is a river under the land, and the man who wants me silent wants the river. And he has been willing to wait a very long time to have it. Now you know. Your father. She knelt on the cabin floor with the letter in her hands and the morning sun coming down through the broken roof onto her shoulders, and the dust hung in the shaft of light like small, slow stars. And somewhere outside the door, an old gray mare was nosing through the bitter brush, and somewhere 4 miles east of the cabin, a creek called Bitterroot ran cold and shallow through a country that had killed a man and called it a fall. The 14th of March. She lowered the letter into her lap. She lifted her eyes to the wall, to the unfinished map, to the faint blue lines her father had drawn across it, that she now understood were not lines on a surface at all, but lines beneath it, the veins of the sleeping river, the secret pulse of the country, the thing he had given his life to find, and the thing he had given his life for. The sun climbed. The light in the cabin shifted. Outside in the great silent country, the wind began to move again across the dry grass, and the small dust devils of the morning rose and fell and rose again. And the old mare lifted her head and looked east toward the creek called Bitterroot, as if she too had heard a question being asked. Marin folded the letter carefully. She put it in the pocket of her dress. She pressed her hand flat against it for a long moment, as if to confirm to herself that it was real, that her father had written it, that the country had finally spoken. Then she stood up. She had a great deal to do. She rode back to Coyote Bend 3 days later with the unfinished map rolled in oilcloth on the seat beside her, and her father's letter folded small in her dress pocket, and the question her father had given her sitting in the middle of her chest like a stone she could not put down. She had spent those 3 days at the cabin. She had not dug. She had not begun any great work. She had walked the parcel slowly with the second journal open in her hand, the journal of the strange, beautiful maps comparing the lines her father had drawn against the country she stood in. She had found the point where Penny had stood that first dawn, the central node of the hairline cracks, and she had marked it with 3 small stones piled into a cairn no taller than her knee. She had cleaned the cabin. She had swept the dust of years out the open door. She had hung an old wool blanket across the broken window. She had set the trunk inside in the corner where the morning light would find it. And every night when the desert cooled and the stars came out, she had lain on her back on the wagon bed with the letter in her hand and read it again until she could have spoken it aloud from memory, until her father's voice had become indistinguishable in her mind from her own. She rode back to town because she needed to ask Wendell Pike a question. She arrived at the livery in the late afternoon when the sun was beginning to soften and the long shadows of the cottonwoods were stretching across the street. Wendell was at the back of the stable, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, his big, steady hands working a saddle soap into a length of harness leather. He looked up when she came in. He saw her face. He set down the leather. "Marin, I have read the letter," she said, "and I am ready for the question." He did not ask what letter. He did not ask what question. He simply nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he has been waiting a long time for a thing he both wanted and feared. He led her to the small tack room at the back of the stable, and he closed the door behind them, and they sat on 2 upturned barrels in the smell of leather and neat's-foot oil and the soft dry hay of the loft above their heads. He laced his big hands together on his knees, and he looked down at them for a long moment before he spoke. "I found your father on the morning of the 15th of March, he said, "just past dawn. I had ridden out because he had not come to town the day before, and your father did not miss our Thursday coffee unless he was sick or dead. He was at the place where Bitterroot Creek bends below the cottonwoods, about 4 miles east of his cabin. He was lying on his side in the gravel of the bank. His neck was broken. The doctor came out from town later that morning and said he had broken it in a fall." The county judge agreed. The papers were signed. Your father was buried in the small plot behind the church. That was 4 months ago. She waited. She did not speak. Wendell lifted his eyes to hers. "His horse was found grazing about 100 yards downstream," he said. "Old Brigham, the bay gelding your father had ridden for 11 years. He was wet to the hocks from the creek. He was calm. He was uninjured. There was not a scratch on him, Marin. Not one. The girth had not slipped. The saddle was square on his back. The bridle was in place. I have ridden with your father over country a goat would think twice about. I have watched him sit a horse at a dead run down a scree slope. He did not fall, Marin. Cassius did not fall off Old Brigham on a flat stretch of gravel beside a creek he had crossed 1,000 times. He did not. I have known it for 4 months, and I have not said it out loud to a single soul, because to say it out loud is to call a man a liar or a murderer, and I do not have the proof to do either. She felt her own hands trembling. She pressed them flat against her thighs. Was he alone? That is the part I cannot answer, Wendell said. There were tracks at the creek, a second horse, a shod horse. The tracks led down from the high country east of the cabin, and they led back up into the high country east of the cabin, and they were old enough by the time I saw them that I could not say how old they were. They could have been from that night. They could have been from a week before. I lost them in the rocks above the creek. I rode for 3 days looking for where they came out, and I never found a clean print. Whoever rode that horse rode careful, Marin. Rode like a man who did not want to be followed. He stopped. He did not say a name. He did not need to. She thought of Beaumont Drexler on his black stallion. She thought of the careful, unhurried way he sat the saddle. She thought of his $800 in gold and his $25 in cash and his face at the mercantile counter, the face of a man who had been waiting for her to come home. She thought of the photograph. 2 men smiling. 12 years ago, summer of 77. He told me, she said slowly, that he and my father had been associated in a business capacity. He told you the truth, Wendell said. But not all of it. They were more than associated. They were partners. For years, Marin. They were the closest thing your father ever had to a brother out here. They rode together. They surveyed together. They sat at this very stove together in the winter of 78, when the snow lay 6 feet deep against the north wall of the stable, and they could not get out to the country. And they drank my coffee, and they argued about rocks like 2 boys arguing about which marble was better. His voice had gone quiet. Something happened between them. I do not know what. Your father would not speak of it. One spring, perhaps 4 years ago, they were partners. The next spring, they were not. They stopped riding together. They stopped speaking. When they met on the street, they tipped their hats to each other like strangers. Whatever it was deep, and it was final, and your father carried it to Bitterroot Creek with him. Marin sat in the dim of the tack room and breathed. There is something else, Wendell said. Something I have been holding to give you. Your father came here 3 days before he died. He brought a box. He said he was going to leave it with me for a while. He said if anything ever happened to him, I was to give it to you. He said nothing more than that. I have kept it under the floor of the harness room for 4 months. He stood and went to the corner of the tack room where a heavy wooden trunk held bits and bridles, and he moved the trunk aside, and he lifted a section of plank from the floor beneath, and from the hollow underneath he drew out a small flat box of dark wood, no larger than a Bible. He brought it back to the upturned barrel and set it in her lap. She lifted the lid. Inside was a small brass key, plain and unornamented, and a folded sheet of paper. The paper bore an address in her father's hand. Mr. Theodore Ashby, Surveyor Emeritus, 412 Ferguson Street, Cheyenne. Beneath the address in her father's smaller writing, 2 more words. He knows. She closed the box. She held it in both hands and looked at Wendell across the small space of the tack room, and her voice when it came out was very steady, steadier than she felt. "I am going to need to ride to Cheyenne," she said. "I'll lend you the bay," Wendell said. "Faster than Penny. 2 days each way if you push him." "Will you watch over Penny while I am gone?" "Like she was my own." She stood. She tucked the box into the deep pocket of her dress beside her father's letter. She took a step toward the door. "Marin?" She stopped. "Whatever you find in Cheyenne," he said, "you ride straight back here when you are done. You do not stop in the country. You do not let dark catch you on the road alone. Are you hearing me? I am hearing you, Wendell." She rode out at dawn on Wendell's big bay gelding, a horse called Marshall, who knew the road to Cheyenne the way an old preacher knows the road to church. The country opened around her in the long, pale folds she remembered from the wagon ride to the flats. But now she was moving faster, the bay's steady canter eating the miles, the wind in her face, the rolled oilcloth bundle of her father's most precious maps strapped behind her cantle. She rode east through the broken country, and then north through the long valley of the Sweetwater, and she made camp the first night under a stand of cottonwoods beside a small creek that ran cold and clean over a bed of round stones. She slept poorly. The dreams came again. The low hum beneath the earth. Her father's voice she could almost hear, and not quite. She reached Cheyenne in the middle of the second afternoon, dusty, and saddle-sore the bay's flanks dark with sweat. The city was a shock to her after the silence of the country. The clatter of wheels on hard pavement, the bray of mules, the dense smells of coal smoke and beer and horse sweat, and the rendered fat of 100 kitchens. She found a livery on the south end where Marshall could be properly stabled and rubbed down and given a measure of oats, and she walked the bay's reins into the man's hand and asked for directions to Ferguson Street, and a boy in a leather apron led her 4 blocks east through the late afternoon crowd. The house at 412 Ferguson was small and trim, set back from the street behind a low picket fence, freshly whitewashed. A garden of late summer flowers ran along the path to the door. The man who answered her knock was perhaps 70 years old, white-haired, slight of frame, with the gold-rimmed spectacles of a scholar and the work-roughened hands of a man who had spent his life out of doors. He looked at her once, and his face changed. "You have his eyes," he said. "Come inside." He sat her in a small parlor crowded with books and rolled maps and the instruments of his profession. He brought her tea in a china cup that did not quite match its saucer. He sat opposite her in an armchair worn to the wood at the elbows, and he listened without speaking while she told him what she knew and what she suspected and what her father's letter had said. When she was done, he set down his own cup with the slow, careful motion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is glad to set it down. "Your father wrote to me last December," he said. "He said he believed he was in danger. He said he had completed a survey of an aquifer system beneath the western valleys of Carbon County, a system no one had previously documented of a size that would change the economics of the entire territory. He said he had filed his findings with the United States Geological Survey in Washington in the proper form, and that he had not yet received confirmation that the filing had been received and recorded. He asked me in confidence to hold a duplicate of his survey documents in my office in case the original should be lost. He sent the duplicate to me by registered post in January. I have held it for him since. He rose. He walked to a tall cabinet in the corner of the parlor and unlocked the bottom drawer with a small brass key and lifted out a portfolio of heavy cardboard tied with black ribbon. He set it on the low table between them and untied the ribbon and opened the portfolio. Inside lay maps. Maps drawn in her father's hand. The same blue lines she had seen in the journals, but rendered here in finished form, with the precise notations of latitude and longitude and elevation and stratum that a government survey required. There were field reports in her father's hand. There were laboratory analyses of water samples signed by a chemist in Denver. There were photographs of rock formations taken with a heavy plate camera that her father must have hauled into the country on the back of old Brigham. It was the work of years. It was the proof of everything. "I wrote to Washington in February," Ashby said quietly, "on your father's behalf, to ask after the status of his filing. I received a reply from the survey in April. They had no record of any filing by Cassius Holloway in any year. None. Not in 88. Not in 87. Not ever. The papers your father swore he sent had never arrived." Marin stared at the maps spread across the low table. "They were intercepted," she said. "That is what I believe, yes." "By whom?" Ashby looked at her over the rim of his spectacles. "The postmaster in Coyote Bend in the fall and winter of last year," he said, "was a man named Jasper Lyle, a man with a fondness for whiskey and a small ranch he could not afford, and a brother-in-law who worked as a foreman on a large cattle operation east of the dry wash. I do not have proof, but a man who is willing to take a small bribe to misplace a particular piece of registered mail does not need to be a clever man. He only needs to be a desperate one." Drexler Marin thought. Of course, Drexler. "There is another matter," Ashby said, "of which you should be aware. The Congress of the United States is considering an amendment to the Desert Land Act. The amendment will, when passed, grant water rights to the first party who can demonstrate documented scientific discovery of a subterranean water source on public or unclaimed land. The amendment is expected to be voted upon before the end of the current session. If your father's filing had gone through, he would have held the rights to the entire aquifer beneath the western valleys, with all that implies for irrigation, for cattle operations, for the founding of new settlements. Those rights would have passed to you upon his death. They have not passed to you because the filing was suppressed. And whoever suppressed it now has the opportunity in the coming weeks to file a discovery claim of his own. Whoever files first under the amended act will hold the rights for himself. Marin held the edge of the low table very tightly. "How long?" she said. "The vote is expected in October, perhaps November. After that, there will be a window of perhaps 60 days during which discovery claims may be filed. The first valid claim wins." She closed her eyes. She thought of Beaumont Drexler's pale blue eyes and his unhurried smile and his patience. She understood now what the patience had been for. He had been waiting for her father to die. He had been waiting for the survey records to be suppressed. He had been waiting for the law to change so that he could file his own claim on her father's discovery. He had been waiting for her to fail and sell and go away. He had not waited for her father to die. He had killed her father in some way, in some manner she could not yet name, and then he had waited. She opened her eyes. Theodore Ashby was watching her with the steady, patient gaze of a man who had given her bad news and was now waiting to see what kind of woman she was going to be in receiving it. "Mr. Ashby," she said, "will you keep these documents safe a little longer?" "For as long as you need." "And will you, if it should come to that ride to Coyote Bend, and swear to what you have told me before a federal officer of the court?" He smiled, then a small, sad smile, and he reached across the low table and laid his old hand briefly on hers. "Your father," he said, "asked me the same question in his letter of last December. I gave him the same answer I will give you now. I am 71 years old, and I have been waiting all my life for a thing worth swearing to. Yes, I will ride to Coyote Bend." She left Cheyenne at first light the next morning. She rode hard. She did not stop for a noon meal. She walked Marshall down the steep places and let him canter the long valleys. And she watched the road behind her as much as she watched the road ahead, and the dust she raised behind her hung in the still air like a long red flag she did not want to be carrying. She made camp the first night in a cold, dry coulee and did not light a fire. She ate jerky and a heel of bread and slept 3 hours and rode on. She reached the outskirts of Coyote Bend at the middle of the second afternoon. She did not ride into town. She skirted Coyote Bend in a long, looping arc to the south, crossed the dry wash at a place she remembered from her girlhood, and came in on the cinder flats from the southwest, riding the bay through the broken country with her hat pulled low and her eyes scanning the horizon for any movement that did not belong. The country gave back nothing. The sun was a flat white coin in a flat blue sky. The wind moved across the sage in long, patient waves. She crested the low ridge above her father's cabin in the late afternoon, and she reined the bay in, and she sat there on Marshall's back for a long, quiet moment, looking down at what had been done. The cabin had been partly burned. The roof on the south side was gone, charred timbers leaning into the open air. The door hung from its leather hinge, but the door itself was scorched black. Someone had tried to set the place ablaze, and the fire had not quite caught the way they meant it to, because the timbers were too dry on the outside and not dry enough on the inside, and the night wind had come up wrong, and the cabin still stood. Just. Penny was alive. The mare was standing in the small corral Marin had built behind the cabin from cottonwood poles. She was favoring her right foreleg. Even from the ridge, Marin could see the angle of it, the careful way Penny held the leg up off the ground. Someone had hurt the horse. Someone had come in the night and hurt the horse and tried to burn the cabin. Marin rode down from the ridge slowly. She tied Marshall to the half-burned hitching post, and she walked to the corral, and she looked at Penny's leg. The cannon bone was bruised. The skin was broken in a long, shallow gash, the kind a man might make with the toe of a heavy boot, driven hard into the leg of a horse that could not get out of his way. Penny stood quietly under her hand. The mare's dark eyes were patient and resigned and very tired. "All right, old girl," Marin said softly. "All right. I am here. I am here now." She tended the leg. She washed the gash with water from the barrel and packed it with the small jar of carbolic salve she had bought in Cheyenne. She wrapped the cannon bone in clean cotton bandages from her saddlebag. The mare flinched once when the salve went into the open skin, and then she stood and let Marin finish. Then Marin walked to the cabin. The door pushed open on its single leather hinge. Inside, the floor was wet with the soot of half-burned wood, and the smell was acrid and sour. The trunk was still in its corner. Someone had tried to open it and failed because the brass lock had held, and the wood of the lid was deeply gouged where they had worked at it with a knife or a pry bar. The wall map of the parcel had been torn down from the wall and lay crumpled on the floor. The unfinished map. Her father's last work. She knelt and picked it up and smoothed it carefully on the floorboards. A note had been pinned to the wall where the map had been. A piece of stiff paper pierced through with the point of a Bowie knife driven into the wood up to the hilt. The note had been written in a heavy hand with a coarse pencil. "Sell or go. 1 week." She read the note twice. She did not take it down. She left the knife in the wall. She stood in the small, ruined cabin in the late afternoon light, and she felt something pass through her chest that she did not recognize at first because she had not felt it before. It was not fear. Fear she had felt many times in her life. It was not grief. Grief she had been living inside of for 4 months. It was something colder and clearer than either of those. It was the steady, patient anger of a person who has been pushed exactly one step too far. It set into her like a vein of iron set into stone. She walked outside. She stood on the broken porch and she looked across her father's land, the 160 acres of cracked clay and bitter sage that nobody had wanted, the small piled cairn of stones where Penny had stood that first morning. And she understood with absolute clarity what she was going to do. She was going to find what her father had found. She was going to find it before they came back. The next morning, before the sun, she began. She moved Penny into the cabin itself, sweeping out a corner of the unburned floor and laying down clean straw and rigging a feed bucket, because she did not want the mare in the corral where any man who rode in could see her or get to her. She drew water from her barrels, the last of what she had, and she carried 2 full buckets out to the cairn. And she set the buckets aside. And she took her father's pickaxe and her father's shovel from the lean-to behind the cabin where Wendell had said her father kept them, and she carried the tools to the place where Penny had stood, and she began to dig. The ground was iron. The first stroke of the pick rang against the baked clay like a bell. The second came back with such force she felt the impact travel up the handle and into the bones of her arms and shoulders. She drew a breath. She swung again. The first hour she dug a hole the size of a tin plate. The second hour she dug a hole the size of a dinner platter. By the end of the first day, she had a shallow pit, perhaps 2 feet across and a foot deep, and her palms had broken open at the base of the thumbs, and her shoulders burned, and she could not lift the pick above her head one more time. She sat in the dust beside the pit, with the lowering sun behind her, and she ate a strip of jerky and a small handful of dried apples, and she did not speak even to herself. The next morning, she wrapped her hands in strips of cotton from a torn sheet, and she went back to the pit. By the 3rd day, she had broken through the surface layer of baked clay into a softer stratum of dry sandy soil that came out by the shovel load. She made better time. She dug deeper. She dug all morning and stopped at noon to drink water and eat and rest in the small square of shadow at the cabin wall, and she dug all afternoon. And at the end of the 3rd day, she was waist deep in the hole, and she could feel a small, steady draft of cool air rising past her face from somewhere deep in the dust at the bottom of the pit, a draft that smelled faintly of wet stone. On the 4th day, she remembered the box. She climbed out of the pit at midday and walked to the cabin, and she sat on the floor, and she opened the small flat box Wendell had given her, and she lifted out the small brass key, and she sat for a long time looking at it and trying to understand what it was meant to open. It was too small to open the oak trunk. The oak trunk's lock had taken the iron key Wendell had given her the first day. This key was a different shape. The bow was simpler. The bit was finer. She turned the key in the light. She turned it again. She set it down on the floor, and she sat very still, and she looked at the trunk, and she remembered suddenly and clearly the way the trunk had been built. The trunk had a velvet-lined recess in the underside of the lid where the photograph had rested. She had not thought to look beyond the recess. She had not thought in the dim of the small room behind the livery on the first night that a man like her father, a man who hid his most important work in a private alphabet of his own invention, might have built more than one compartment into the trunk that held his most important work. She crossed the floor and she knelt before the trunk. She opened the heavy lid. She lifted out the journals one by one and laid them on the floor. She lifted out the rolled parchments one by one. She emptied the trunk to the wood of the bottom, and then she ran her fingers along the inside of the lid, along the inside of the walls, along the bottom, and at the back of the trunk, where the lid met the wall in a heavy oak hinge. She found a small raised pin. She pressed it. A panel slid down with the soft, well-oiled motion of a thing built by a craftsman in the false wall at the back of the trunk's interior. Behind the panel was a long, narrow compartment, no taller than her hand, that ran the length of the trunk. Inside the compartment, in a wash of late afternoon light from the broken roof, lay a small leather satchel and a folded paper bound with a length of black ribbon. She lifted the satchel out first. It was heavy. She loosened the drawstring. Inside were 3 large gold coins, double eagles, and a sheaf of banknotes, amounting, when she counted them later, to $432. More money than she had ever seen at once in her life. Money enough to keep her in the country for a year if she lived carefully. Her father had been planning. He had known. He had set aside what he could. She lifted out the folded paper next. It was a single sheet, folded once sealed, with a small disc of red wax that had been stamped with the impression of her father's signet ring. The wax was unbroken. He had written across the outside fold a single line. "Read this only when you have found the water." She held the sealed paper in her hand for a long moment. Then she set it carefully aside on the floor, and she did not break the seal. Not yet. Her father had asked her one thing. She would honor it. She went back to the pit. She dug for 6 more days. By the morning of the 10th day, she was chest deep in the hole, and the dust she pulled out was no longer dust, but the coarse, damp sand of a deeper country, and the smell that came up at her was the smell of wet stone and old slow time, and a deep cold that had been sleeping under the desert since before there were men in it. Her hands were knotted at the knuckles. Her shoulders had hardened into something different from the shoulders of the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach a month earlier. The skin of her face had darkened to the color of new copper. She did not look in any mirror, but she could feel the change in her. On the morning of the 10th day, her shovel struck stone. It was not the dull thud of metal into clay. It was a sharp, ringing clang, the sound of iron striking sandstone, the sound of a tool meeting the bones of the earth. The handle of the shovel jumped in her hands. She stood very still in the bottom of the pit, and she felt her heart beating against the cotton of her shirt. And then she lowered the shovel, and she knelt down, and she brushed the damp sand aside with her bare hands. A pale curve of stone, smooth and rounded, rose to meet her palm. She brushed away more sand. The stone widened. It was not the edge of a boulder. It was the edge of a slab. A vast, flat slab of pale yellow sandstone running at a slight angle below the floor of the pit, the surface of it scored, when she had cleared a wider patch with the same intricate network of hairline cracks she had seen on the surface that first dawn. The same delicate pattern, the same converging lines. Carved it seemed into the very face of the stone itself, as if the country had inscribed its own diagram of itself onto the lid it had laid down to keep its secrets. She sat back on her heels in the bottom of the pit, and she let the breath come out of her in a long, shaking exhalation. Capstone her father had written in the journals, where the breath of the deep earth surfaces. She had found it. She climbed out of the pit, and she walked on legs that felt strangely light into the cabin. She took down the unfinished wall map that she had pinned back up after smoothing it. She laid it on the floor. She looked at it with new eyes. There, at the point on the map that corresponded to the cairn outside, her father had drawn a small symbol she had not understood before. A circle with a horizontal line through it. The symbol of a sealed source. Beneath it, in his small, precise hand, 3 words she had been reading every day and had not fully understood until this moment. Where the river sleeps. She sat on the cabin floor, and she lowered her face into her hands, and she did not cry, because she had used up her crying weeks ago in a small rented room above a milliner's shop in Pennsylvania. But she sat for a long time with her face in her hands while the afternoon light moved across the floor, and Penny shifted her weight in the corner on her bandaged leg, and a slow, great peace settled over her that she had not felt in a long time. The next 2 days she gave to the work of leverage. She knew she could not lift the capstone alone. The stone was the size of a kitchen table, perhaps larger. It weighed, by her best guess, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 pounds. But she did not need to lift it. She only needed to move it. She found in the lean-to behind the cabin a long iron pry bar that her father had used for working rocks out of harder soil. She found a coil of heavy hemp rope. She found 2 short lengths of seasoned cottonwood that her father had cut for some purpose she would never know. She set the cottonwood in place as a fulcrum at the edge of the slab, and she wedged the iron pry bar into a fissure at the edge of the stone, and on the morning of the 12th day, with the pry bar set and the rope rigged, she put her whole weight against the lever. Nothing. She tried again. She set her boots against the wall of the pit, and she leaned her whole body backward against the bar, and her arms shook, and her back screamed, and her vision dimmed at the edges. Nothing. The stone held. The country held its secret with the patience of 10,000 years. She rested. She drank a long draught of water from her last barrel. She thought of her father. She thought of his patience, the patience that had let him spend years drawing maps no one had asked him to draw. The patience that had let him sit at a table while his daughter slammed a door and walked out of the cabin and out of his life. The patience that had let him keep silent before Beaumont Drexler for years, hiding his great discovery, knowing what he had found, and refusing to share it, refusing to sell it, refusing to give up. She thought of patience. She set the pry bar a little differently. She moved the cottonwood fulcrum half an inch closer to the slab. She put her weight against the bar again, but this time slowly, gradually leaning her whole body the way her father had told her once when she was 9 to lean against an iron gate that would not open, leaning not with the muscles of the arms, but with the weight of the bones, asking the gate rather than commanding it. The stone shifted. It was the smallest movement, a quarter of an inch. But it was a movement, and with the movement came a sound, a deep, grinding groan that seemed to rise not from the slab itself, but from the country beneath it, the slow voice of a thing being asked after a long sleep to wake. And then a smell came up out of the gap, cool, damp, the smell of wet stone and old slow water, and a kind of mineral sweetness she had never breathed before in her life. She worked the lever for the rest of that day. Patient, slow, a quarter inch, half an inch. By the time the sun began to lower, she had moved the great slab perhaps 3 feet from its bed. A dark crescent of opening lay revealed at the edge, no wider than her hand, but wide enough. She lit the kerosene lantern. She tied the lantern to a length of cord, and she lowered it slowly into the dark. The flame guttered, steadied. It descended 10 feet, 20, 25. And then the light stopped reflecting off the rough walls of a natural shaft and began to reflect off something else. Something below the walls, something that shimmered and moved and broke the light into 100 trembling, small, bright pieces. Water, a pool of it, clear, still, deep beyond reckoning. She drew the lantern back up slowly. Her hands were trembling. She sat at the edge of the small, dark opening for a long while in the lowering light. She did not speak. She did not weep. She placed one hand flat on the cool stone of the partly moved capstone, and she felt beneath her palm the faint, deep humming that her dreams had been trying to tell her about for a month. The sleeping river, It was real. She went to the cabin in the dusk, and she took down the sealed paper her father had left in the false compartment of the trunk, the paper inscribed with the words, "Read this only when you have found the water." She carried it back to the edge of the open pit. She broke the wax seal with her thumbnail. She unfolded the paper in the last light. Her father's writing was small and careful, the way it always was when he was telling her something he had thought about for a long time. Marin, if you have read this, you have done it. You have found what I gave my life trying to find. You have proven to yourself and to the country that the daughter of Cassius Holloway can read the language of the stone. Listen to me now. What I have left you is a great thing. But a great thing in the wrong hands becomes a great evil. I was wrong in my pride to think I could hold this discovery alone. I hid it from the man who was once my friend, because I had come to fear what he would do with it. And in my hiding, I gave him reason to do worse than I feared. I want you to understand something. Beaumont Drexler was the truest friend I had in this country for 10 years. We surveyed the Sweetwater together in 77. We rode the Bitterroot in 78. We started this partnership as brothers, and we ended it as enemies. And the fault for that ending is not his alone. I bear it too. I bear more of it than he knows. There came a season when I learned that the discovery beneath the cinder flats was greater than I had first believed, and I chose in that season not to tell him. I chose to file alone. I chose to keep the river for myself and for you, and for the small private kingdom I thought I could build with it. That choice was not the choice of a friend. It was the choice of a frightened man. I made it. I have lived to regret it. If you read this, Marin, you will be tempted to do what I did. You will be tempted to hold the river close. You will have reasons. The man who has wronged us will offer you reasons. Your own grief will offer you reasons. Do not listen to those reasons. The river is not a possession. The river is a trust. Do not hold it alone. Do not let it fall to the railroads, or to any one man, or to any one family. Find a way to give it to the valley. Find a way to give it to the small ranchers and the small farmers who will need it after you and I are gone. The country will be better for that than for any deed you could hold in your own name. I have loved you, Marin, more than I knew how to say. I learned to listen to the stone because I could not learn to listen to my own daughter. Forgive me if you can. Listen to the country I have left you. Listen the way I tried to teach you, your father. She folded the paper. She sat for a long time at the edge of the dark opening with the cooling earth beneath her and the cooling sky above her, and the lantern beside her cast a small, steady ring of yellow light that did not reach to the place where the sleeping river lay. She thought of the burned cabin behind her, and of Penny's bandaged leg, and of the knife driven into the wall, and of the note that read, "Sell or go." She thought of Beaumont Drexler. She thought of the brother he had been to her father in a younger country 12 years ago, when men still smiled together for cameras on the tops of mountains. She thought of what her father had asked of her. She rose. She walked back to the cabin. She set the folded letter inside the trunk in the false compartment beneath the second panel her father had built for her. She closed the trunk. She washed her face in the last clean water from the barrel. Outside in the great silence of the country, she could hear very faintly on the wind that had come up from the east the sound of hoofbeats. Several horses, coming hard. She stepped to the cabin door and looked out into the gathering dark. 4 riders, moving fast. Less than a mile out across the flats, dark shapes against the last red of the western horizon coming at a gallop. She turned back into the cabin. She crossed to the corner where her father had hung his old shotgun on 2 iron pegs, the shotgun she had taken down and cleaned and oiled 3 nights ago when she had not been certain why. She lifted it down. She broke it open. She fed 2 shells into the chambers from the small box on the mantel. She snapped the breech closed. She walked back to the door. She stepped out onto the porch in the last light with the shotgun in her hands and the sleeping river behind her in the open ground. And she stood there, waiting for the 4 riders to come. They came in fast across the last red light of the western sky, and the dust they raised rose behind them in a long, pale plume that the lowering sun turned the color of dried blood. 4 riders. She counted them as they came. She watched the shapes of them resolve out of the gathering dark. The long coats, the wide hats, the rifles laid across the saddle bows, the easy practiced way they sat their horses. These were not men who had come to argue. She stepped off the porch. She did not stand in the cabin doorway. The doorway was a frame, and a frame made a target. She had read that in a book once in the small library above her father's workshop, in a book about the Indian Wars that she had not understood at the time and that she understood now. She moved instead to the corner of the cabin where the burned timbers of the south wall met the unburned timbers of the east. The riders pulled up at the edge of her father's land, 40 yards out. They sat their horses in a loose half circle. The man at the center, a little forward of the others, swung down from his saddle and dropped the reins. His horse stood. The man took 2 steps toward the cabin. He was a tall man. He moved with the looseness of a man who had been in many such moments and had not yet found one he could not walk out of. The light was failing fast, but she could see the shape of him. A long duster, the color of old whiskey. A flat-brimmed hat pulled low. A revolver on his right hip, and a rifle in his left hand held loose, the barrel pointing down. "Miss Holloway." His voice carried clean across the flats. It was a calm voice. It was almost gentle. "My name is Thaddeus Renner. I work for Mr. Drexler. I have come out here this evening to do you the courtesy of explaining to you what is going to happen now." She did not answer.
"Mr. Drexler is a patient man," Renner said. "He has been patient with your father for many years. He has been patient with you for a month. The patience is at an end. You will sell your land. You will accept the price Mr. Drexler has offered. You will leave this country tonight or tomorrow at the latest, and you will not come back. If you do these things, no harm will come to you. If you do not do these things, harm will come. Not from my hand. Not from any hand you would ever see coming.
But it will come. I have been asked to tell you this so that the choice is yours. I am telling you, the choice is yours." She let the silence sit for a long count. Then she spoke, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Mr. Renner, you have ridden a long way to deliver a message. I will give you my answer, and then you will ride a long way back." "I am listening, ma'am."
"My answer is the same as the one I gave Mr. Drexler at the mercantile. This land is not for sale, not for $25, not for $800, not for any sum. I will be on this land tomorrow morning. I will be on it the morning after that. I will be on it for as long as I draw breath. You may carry that message back to your employer, and you may add to it from me a second message. The next man who lays a hand on my horse will not ride home." A small silence.
Renner tilted his head a fraction. She could see even in the failing light the small private smile that moved across his face. It was not unkind. It was the smile of a professional man who has just heard something he respects against his own interest.
"That is a fair message,"
he said.
"I will carry it, but I will tell you this, ma'am, as one human creature to another. Mr. Drexler has not sent 4 armed men out to your cabin to negotiate. He has sent 4 armed men out to your cabin to make a point. The point is going to be made one way or another tonight. I would prefer that it be made with words, but it will be made." He took another step forward. She raised the shotgun. She raised it slowly. She brought the stock to her shoulder. She set her cheek against the wood. She aimed not at Renner, but 10 feet to his left at the empty air above the head of his ground-tied horse, and she squeezed the trigger. The roar of the shotgun went out across the flats like a thunderclap. The horses behind Renner shied and crow-hopped. One of the men cursed. Renner himself did not move. He stood exactly where he had stood, and he watched her across the gathering dark, and after a long moment, he reached up and touched the brim of his hat. The slow, careful touch of a man acknowledging something he had not expected. "That was a warning shot, Miss Holloway." "It was." "The next one will not be." A longer silence now. The horses behind Renner had quieted. The men sat their saddles. She could feel the weight of their attention on her like a cold hand. "I have 1 barrel left," she said. "There are 4 of you. I am not a foolish woman.
I know how that math goes, but I will tell you something, Mr. Renner. The first man who crosses my fence will go down. I do not care which of you it is. I do not care whether he is the one who fired or the one who watched. He will go down. If you want to be that man, you may ride forward. If you do not, you may turn your horses, and you may go. Renner stood for a long moment.
Then slowly he lowered the rifle that he had been holding loose at his side. He let the barrel drop until it pointed at the ground. He turned his head a quarter of an inch and called something back to his men that she could not hear, and behind him, in the lowering dusk, the 3 mounted riders reined their horses around and began at a walking pace to ride back the way they had come. Renner did not turn. He stood facing her in the dark.
Mr. Drexler, he said, did not tell me what kind of woman you were. I think he did not know.
He did not.
It will go harder now. It may.
I will tell him what you have said about the horse.
Thank you.
He touched the brim of his hat once more with the small, old-fashioned formality of a man who had been taught manners somewhere a long time ago. And he turned and walked to his horse and swung up into the saddle in one easy motion. And he gathered the reins, and he sat there for one more long moment, looking back at the cabin. And then he turned the horse and rode after his men into the dark. She stood at the corner of the cabin with the shotgun against her hip until the sound of the hoofbeats had faded entirely. Until the silence of the country had come back. Until the first true stars had pricked through above the long line of the western mountains. Then her knees gave out very gently, and she sat down in the dust with her back against the wall of the cabin and the shotgun across her lap. And she let her body do what her mind would not let it do until that moment. She shook. She shook for a long time. Her teeth chattered, though the night was not cold. Her hands trembled around the warm steel of the shotgun. Behind her, in the corner of the cabin, Penny shifted on her bandaged leg and let out a long, slow sigh. It was the only sound in the world. She slept 3 hours that night, and she slept with the shotgun beside her on the blanket, and her father's letter folded in her shirt pocket against her heart. She woke before the sun. She drank a cup of cold coffee from the pot she had left on the stove the night before. She walked outside and looked at the country. The morning was strange. The sky to the west was the clean, cold blue of a high country dawn, but the sky to the east was wrong. It had a yellow cast to it, a sickly bruised color along the horizon, and the air had a stillness to it that she had felt only once before in her life when she was a girl. And her father had taken her by the shoulder and walked her quickly into the house and barred the door. She knew this air. A duster was coming. A bad one. She did not waste a minute. She moved with the speed of a woman who had grown up in country that punished slowness. She brought Penny fully into the cabin and tied her loose in the corner. She put fresh hay before her. She brought in the 2 empty water barrels and set them inside against the inner wall. She brought in her saddle her father's tools, the small box from the false compartment of the trunk, the sealed letter. She nailed the door of the cabin shut on its single leather hinge with 3 short cedar boards braced across the frame. She climbed up onto the half-burned roof, and she pulled the loose timbers tight where she could, and she nailed canvas across the largest of the open holes. She did all of this in the time it took the sun to climb a hand's breadth above the eastern mountains, and by the time she was finished, the yellow had spread across half the sky, and the wind had begun to move. It came on through the morning. The first gusts were small things, little dry breaths that rattled the cottonwood she had cut for kindling and made the bandages on Penny's leg flutter. Then the wind grew. It steadied. It rose to a constant low moan that seemed to come from the country itself, from the cracked clay and the dry sage and the long pale horizons. By mid-morning, the moan had become a roar. The yellow sky had gone brown. The sun had become a pale disk you could look at with the naked eye, and then it had disappeared altogether, and the day had turned to a heavy, gritty twilight, and the air inside the cabin had gone the color of dirty tea. The fine sand came through every crack. It came under the door. It came through the gaps in the canvas she had nailed across the roof. It came down the chimney of the cold stove. It settled on every surface and worked its way into her hair and her mouth and the corners of her eyes. Penny lowered her head and turned her face to the inner wall and stood very still. Marin wrapped her head in a wet cloth she had soaked from the last of the drinking water in her canteen, and she sat with her back against the trunk and her father's letter pressed against her heart. The roar went on for hours. It was in the middle of the second hour when she had begun to believe that the storm would never lift that she heard, through the howl of the wind, a sound that should not have been there. A human voice. She lifted her head. She thought at first that she had imagined it, a trick of the wind, a piece of the storm passing through the broken timbers of the cabin in a particular way. But then it came again, a cry, not close, faint, torn nearly to nothing by the gale, but human. She rose. She crossed the cabin floor, and she pulled aside the canvas she had nailed across the broken window on the east wall, and she pressed her face to the small, dirty square of glass that remained, and she peered out into the brown howl. She could see almost nothing. But there, perhaps 50 yards out, perhaps less, she could make out a darker shape against the lighter brown of the storm. A wagon, overturned, and beside it, huddled against the lee of the wagon bed, the shape of figures. Several figures, smaller and larger, pressed together. A family. She did not stop to think. She had thought about it her whole life, and she did not stop to think now. She crossed to the door, and she pried loose the cedar boards she had nailed across the frame, and she wrapped the wet cloth a second turn around her face and she pushed the door open into the storm. The wind hit her like a horse. She had to bend nearly double to walk into it. The sand cut at the small patches of her face the cloth did not cover. She could not see her own boots beneath her. She walked into the brown howl with her hands stretched in front of her, the way a blind woman walks into an unknown room, and she pushed herself forward, yard by yard against the gale. She reached the wagon by feel. She felt the rough wood of the bed, first the sharp, splintered edge where the wood had cracked in the fall. She moved her hand along the wood until she found the wheel, and she moved along the wheel until she found, on the leeward side, the small huddle of bodies pressed against the wagon's shelter. A man, a woman, a child, a second child, smaller. The man saw her first. His eyes went wide above the bandana he had tied across his own face. He grabbed her arm and shouted something at her that the wind tore away, and she shook her head and pointed back the way she had come, and the man understood. He nodded once, and he gathered the smaller child into his arms, and the woman gathered the larger child against her body, and Marin took the woman's free hand in her own, and together, the five of them, leaning into the wall of the wind, began the long, stumbling walk back to the cabin. She got them inside. She got the door shut behind them. She got the cedar boards braced across the frame again. She got them down to the floor in the corner farthest from the broken roof, and she gave them what was left of her drinking water, and the man drank a swallow and passed the canteen to his wife, and the wife passed it to the older child, and the older child passed it to the smaller, and the smaller drank a tiny mouthful and looked at Marin with eyes the color of clean sky and did not cry. None of them cried. They had been past crying when she reached them. The man's name was Eli Halloran. The woman was his wife, Sarah. The older child was a boy of 7 named Asa. The smaller was a girl of 4 named Hannah. They had been bound for the Oregon country, the man said, by way of Cheyenne and Fort Bridger. They had been camped 2 miles east when the storm had taken them. The wind had upended the wagon. Their horses had broken their tethers and were gone. They had crawled to the lee of the wagon, and they had clung to each other, and they had prayed, and they had heard nothing they could fight, and seen nothing they could run from. And the wife had said quietly to the husband, in the worst of it, that she did not believe they were going to come out the other side. Marin listened. She nodded. She did not say much. When the man asked her, his voice rough with sand, if there was any water left, she looked at him and at the empty canteen on the floor between them. She rose. She crossed the cabin to the small panel in the floor at the back wall, the panel her father had built, and that she had only that morning understood the purpose of the panel that hid the tunnel she had cut from the cabin floor down through the soft sand to the lip of the open shaft she had pried free of the capstone the day before. She had not dug the tunnel for this. She had dug it because she had not wanted, after Renner had ridden away, to step outside the cabin in the dark to draw water. She had dug it because she did not know when the next 4 riders would come. She had dug it because her father had taught her with the patience of a stone that the best defense in this country was preparation. She lowered a bucket on a length of rope down into the dark. She drew it back up full. She brought it to the corner where the Halloran family huddled, and she lifted the canteen, and she filled it slowly, and she held it out to Eli Halloran without speaking. He took it. He drank. His eyes closed. He passed the canteen to his wife, and his wife drank, and her eyes closed, and the canteen passed to the boy and to the girl. And all four of them drank, and none of them said anything for a long while. And when Eli Halloran opened his eyes again, he looked at Marin in the dim brown light of the storm-darkened cabin, and his voice, when it came, was thick and broken.
"What is this water, ma'am?" "It is the water under my land, Mr. Halloran." "Where does it come from?"
She thought a moment.
"From a long way down."
He nodded slowly. He looked at the canteen in his hand. He looked at his wife. He looked at his children. He looked back at her.
"I will tell this story," he said, "in every town I come to until I die." The storm blew for 2 days.
For 2 days, in the small space of the partly burned cabin, with the wind howling outside and the brown air clinging to every surface, the 5 of them and the old gray mare lived together in a way that Marin would not have believed possible a month earlier. She drew water from the well through the floor as the canteens emptied. She fed the children small pieces of jerky and biscuit from her dwindling stores, and Sarah Halloran, when her hands had stopped shaking, took a needle from her apron and mended a tear in Marin's sleeve while they sat against the wall and listened to the wind. Eli Halloran, who had been a carpenter before he had been a homesteader, looked at the burned timbers of the south wall and at the bracework Marin had put up, and he made a small, careful adjustment to one of her cedar braces that improved the whole structure. He did this without speaking. He did this because he had been raised, she could see, by a man who had taught him that a guest pays for his shelter with his hands. On the second night, the wind broke. It went down in stages over the course of an hour, the great roar diminishing to a steady moan, the moan diminishing to a long sigh, and at last, in the small, dead hour before dawn, the sigh diminished to a silence that felt, after 2 days of storm, like the silence of a different world. They went outside in the gray hour. The country was remade. The brown was gone. The yellow was gone. The sky had washed itself clean, blue and high, and impossibly far. A fine new layer of pale sand lay across everything, softening the cracked clay blanketing. The bitter sage drifted in long crescent dunes against the leeward sides of the cabin and the corral and the cottonwoods. The world looked younger than it had 2 days before. It looked like a country waiting to be seen for the first time. They found the Halloran wagon a 1/4 mile east, more or less, where they had left it half buried in a drift, but whole.
The horses were not there. They had run with the storm, and they were gone perhaps to the Bitterroot, perhaps farther. Eli Halloran walked around the wagon and ran his hand along the broken tongue and the cracked siding, and he nodded once to himself.
And he came back to the cabin where his wife and children were sitting in the morning sun with cups of coffee Marin had made on her small stove.
"We have lost the team,"
he said.
"but the wagon is sound. If we can find any horses at all, we can ride it and go on." "You will go on," Marin said. "I will see to that." She walked to the corral where Marshal Wendell Pike's big bay gelding had ridden out the storm with his head down and his rump to the wind. The bay was tired, but he was unhurt. She led him out and saddled him, and she lifted Eli Halloran's wife and his daughter into the wagon when they had set it upright, and she put Asa Halloran on the bay behind his father, and she watched the small family ride west toward Coyote Bend with Marshall pulling steady at the end of a hitch she had rigged out of a length of rope. Eli Halloran turned in the saddle as they crested the low ridge that hid her father's land from the road, and he raised his hat to her, and she raised her hand to him. And then they were gone into the new country the storm had made. She walked back to the cabin alone. She did not know it yet, but the story Eli Halloran had promised to tell was already on its way to Coyote Bend ahead of him. Word travels in country like this the way smoke travels. By the evening of the day, the Hallorans rode into town with their wagon and their 2 children and their tale of a quiet woman on a barren parcel south of the dry wash who had pulled them from the heart of a killer storm and given them water from a well that should not have existed. The saloon was full, and the talk was loud, and the talk was not about the foolish Holloway girl anymore. The talk was about a well. The talk was about water clear and cold and sweet as anything a man had ever drunk drawn up from beneath the cinder flats. The talk was about a young woman who had aimed a shotgun at 4 armed riders and held her ground. Beaumont Drexler heard the talk in the back room of the saloon where he had been sitting with a glass of brandy and a cigar and the late edition of the Cheyenne paper. He set down the brandy. He set down the cigar. He folded the paper. He rode out the next morning alone. He came without a coat. He came without a rifle. He came without Thaddeus Renner or any of his men. He came on the black stallion, but he rode at a walk, not at a gallop, the easy, slow walk of a man who has decided that whatever is going to happen between him and the woman at the end of the road will not be helped by speed. She saw him coming from a long way off. She had been working on the well hauling stones from a tumbled cairn at the south end of the property, laying them around the opening of the shaft to build the low circular wellhead her father's journals had shown her how to build. She had a smudge of pale sandstone dust on her cheek, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and her hair was tied back with a piece of saddle leather. And she watched Beaumont Drexler ride down toward her cabin in the bright, clean morning, and she set down the stone she was holding, and she walked to meet him. She did not bring the shotgun. She did not need to. She knew before he had crossed the last 100 yards of the parcel what kind of meeting this was going to be, because she had seen it in the way he sat the horse. He was not riding to threaten her. He was riding to confess something. He drew up at the edge of her father's land. He sat the stallion for a long moment, looking down at her, and she looked up at him, and the morning sun lay between them like a small distance neither could quite cross. Then he dismounted. He let the reins drop. He took off his hat. He turned the hat slowly in his hands. He did not look like the man at the mercantile counter. He did not look like the man on the trail to the flats. He looked like a man who had not slept the night before, and the night before that, and the night before that.
Miss Holloway, Mr. Drexler, may I sit? There was a low cottonwood stump beside the path to the cabin set there as a step for getting on and off horses. She gestured to it. He sat. He laid the hat on his knee. He did not lift his eyes to her for a long moment.
My man Renner, he said, came back 2 nights ago and told me what you said to him and how you said it. I have spent the time since trying to find words for what I came out here this morning to tell you. I have not found them, so I am going to tell you without them. She waited. Your father and I were friends, he said. I do not mean we were acquaintances. I do not mean we were partners only. I mean that for 9 years of my life, the closest thing I had to a brother in this country was Cassius Holloway. I rode the Sweetwater with him in 77. I rode the Bitterroot with him in 78. I sat at his table on Christmas Day in 79 and ate the venison stew his wife had cooked and held his daughter, who was a small, dark-haired girl of 3. Then, on my knee. You will not remember that. There is no reason you should. But I remember it. I have remembered it every day for 16 years.
His voice was steady, but it had something in it she had not heard before. A tightness, a small frayed edge.
In 86, he said, I made a series of investments in cattle. The investments went badly. I was leveraged to the limit of my holdings. By the autumn of 88, the bank at Cheyenne was preparing papers to take my ranch from me. I went to your father in the November of that year, and I told him my situation. I asked him, as my partner of long standing, as the man who had stood beside me at my own wedding, to share with me the great discovery I knew he had made beneath the cinder flats. I did not know its full extent. I knew only that he had found something because I had watched him spend 2 years drawing the maps. I asked him to share. He refused. He said the discovery was not yet ready to be shared. He said he needed more time. We argued. I called him names I had no right to call him. He called me names he had no right to call me. I left his cabin in a fury. That was a Tuesday,
the 12th of March of this year. She felt her breath catch. On the night of the 14th of March, Drexler said, I rode back out to his cabin. I went alone. I went to make my peace. I went to apologize for the names I had called him and to ask him if there was any way back from what we had said to each other. I was not going to ask again for the discovery. I was going to ask for my friend back. He stopped. He turned the hat slowly in his hands.
He was not at the cabin when I arrived. There was a light burning. There was a pot of stew on the stove. There was an open journal on his work table. But he was not there. I waited an hour. I called his name. There was no answer. I rode out to look for him. I tracked his horse, Old Brigham, by lantern light down toward the Bitterroot. I found him on the gravel of the creek bank, just below the cottonwoods, where the bend of the creek runs east. He was already cold, Miss Holloway. He had been dead some hours when I found him. His neck was broken. I did not break it. I swear to you on my own soul, I did not break it. He had fallen from the horse somehow in the dark, in country, where I would not have believed he could fall. But he had fallen. I knelt by him in the gravel of the creek bank for a long time, and I held my dead friend in my arms, and I did the only thing my fear could think to do. Her hand had gone to her mouth.
I rode away, Drexler said. I rode home. I told no one. By the time Wendell Pike found him the next morning, the tracks I had left at the creek had been crossed by every fool in the county. I knew that if it came out that I had been there the night before, after a quarrel, that half the saloon had heard pieces of no court in this territory would believe I had not killed him. I would be hanged for the death of the man who had been my brother. So I said nothing. I let the fall be a fall.
I told the lie of my absence with my silence. He lifted his eyes to her at last. They were red-rimmed. They were the eyes of a man who had been carrying something for 4 months that would not be carried any longer.
I have come out here this morning, he said, to tell you the truth, not because I think it will save me, not because I expect anything from you. I have come because Renner told me how you stood at that door with your father's shotgun. And I knew when he said it that I had been wrong about you, the way I had been wrong about a great many things, and that the daughter of Cassius Holloway deserved to know what kind of man the friend her father had once kept was,
and what kind of man he had become. I tried to buy this land from you because I told myself I was protecting his memory. That was a lie. I tried to buy it because I was afraid you would find what you have found, and because in some part of myself I will not defend, I still wanted the river. I still wanted what my friend had refused to share with me. I am ashamed of that. I will be ashamed of it until I die. But I will not lie about it any longer. He drew a folded paper from the inside pocket of his coat and held it out to her. She did not take it. What is that? It is a deed of release, drawn up by Mr. Dunmore yesterday afternoon at my instruction. It releases any and all claim I have or could have to your father's parcel, to the aquifer beneath it, to any water rights derivative thereof, to any benefit of any kind arising from the discovery. It is witnessed and notarized. It is final. She still did not take it.
There is one more thing, he said.
He drew a second paper from the inside pocket. This one was older. The fold lines were soft from handling. The paper had been carried.
"Your father wrote me a letter," he said, "on the morning of the 14th of March. He gave it to Wendell Pike to hold for him with instructions to deliver it to me the following Sunday. After he died, Wendell did not know what to do with it. He held it for 2 months. Then, at the end of May, he came to my office and he gave it to me without speaking. He gave it to me, I think, because he is a man who could not abide letting a thing remain undone,
even when he did not know what its delivery would mean.
I have read it every night since. I have not opened it to another soul. I am giving it to you now because it belongs to you more than it has ever belonged to me."
He held out the older paper. This time, she took it. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was her father's. The date was the 14th of March, the morning of the day he died. "Beaumont, I have been awake all night with what we said to each other on Tuesday. I am writing this at first light. I have made a mistake, old friend. I have made a long mistake that goes back further than the words we threw at each other in the dark. I should have brought you in. I should have brought you in 2 years ago when I first understood what lay under the flats.
My pride and my fear kept me silent, and my silence has cost me your trust and cost me the friendship that has been the truest gift this country has given me.
Come out to the cabin on Sunday. Bring your wife. Bring your boys. We will eat together as we used to, and we will sit down at the table after you and we will talk about how to share what I have found. Not how to divide it, how to share it. The discovery is too great for one man, and it is too great for two. But you and I together might find a way to give it back to the valley that it ought to belong to. That is what I should have proposed in November. That is what I will propose on Sunday.
I am sorry, Beaumont. I am sorry for every word. Your brother in everything but blood. Cassius.
The paper trembled in her hands. She did not cry. She had become, over the long weeks at the cabin, a woman who did not cry easily. But she stood in the bright, clean morning sun, with her father's last letter in one hand and Beaumont Drexler's deed of release in the other. And she felt the slow, grave weight of the country settle around her shoulders. And she understood finally and completely what her father had meant when he wrote that the river was a trust and not a possession. She understood what he had been trying to do. She understood that he had died trying to do it. She understood that the man sitting on the cottonwood stump in front of her, the man she had been ready to hate for the rest of her life, had been carrying for 4 months a grief identical in shape to her own. She folded her father's letter once. She folded it again. She lowered herself slowly until she was sitting in the dust at the side of the path, and she sat across from Beaumont Drexler in the bright, clean morning, and the old gray mare lifted her head in the cabin doorway and watched them, and for a long while neither of them spoke. When she did speak, her voice was steady. "Mr. Drexler." "Yes, Miss Holloway. My father asked me in a letter of his own to give the river to the valley, to find a way that no one man and no one family would hold it. I do not know yet how to do that. I do not know enough about the law, and I do not know enough about the country. But I am going to try. And I am going to need help. I am going to need a man who knows the ranchers from the dry wash to the bitter root. A man who can ride out and sit at their tables and talk to them in their own language.
A man who has the standing in this country to make them listen." Drexler did not lift his eyes. "I am that man," he said quietly, "if you will have me. My father said you were a brother to him in everything but blood. He did me an honor I did not deserve." "You will deserve it," she said, "if you do this work with me, not for him, not for me, for the country." He raised his eyes then. The morning sun caught them, and they were not the pale blue glacial eyes she had seen at the mercantile counter. They were the eyes of a man who had been given a second chance he had not expected and did not yet know how to receive. "I will do the work," he said. She held out her hand to him across the small distance. He looked at the hand for a long moment. Then he reached across and took it. His grip was firm. His hand was warm. They held the grip for a count of 3. Then she released him, and she rose, and she walked back to the unfinished wellhead, and Beaumont Drexler sat for a long time on the cottonwood stump in the morning sun, and at last he put on his hat, and he stood, and he walked to the stallion, and he mounted, and he rode back to Coyote Bend at a walk with the deed of release still folded in his hand, because she had not in the end taken it from him. She had not needed to. 6 months later, on a morning in the early spring of 1890, with the cottonwoods along the Bitterroot just beginning to show the green of new leaves, a young couple in a small wagon turned off the main road south of Coyote Bend and followed a track that had not been there a year before, a track worn smooth by many wagons leading southwest through the broken country toward the place that had once been called the Cinder Flats. They came over a low ridge, and they saw it. A small cabin repaired and whitened with a new shingle roof and a porch wide enough for 2 chairs. Behind the cabin, a corral. In the corral, a gray mare grazing on the new spring grass. Beside the cabin, a low circular wellhead of pale sandstone with a small wooden cover. Around the wellhead, a wide patch of impossible green. A vegetable garden, the first shoots of peas and beans pushing through dark, turned earth. A row of cottonwood saplings planted in a line, just beginning to put out the small, soft leaves of their first season. The land was not the Cinder Flats anymore. There was a hand-painted sign beside the track. It read, "Holloway Spring." The young husband reined in.
The young wife, who had a baby on her lap, lifted her hand and pointed. A woman was sitting on the porch of the cabin in a plain, dark dress, with a piece of harness leather across her knees and a needle and an awl in her hands, mending a strap with the slow, practiced motion of a person who had been mending harness for a long time. She looked up when she heard the wagon. She set the leather aside and rose and came down the porch steps to meet them.
"Ma'am,"
the young husband said, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands.
"Pardon us. We have been 3 days on the road from Cheyenne. We heard tell at the last town of a place south of Coyote Bend where a body could fill a barrel and trade fair for it. Would this be the place?"
The woman smiled. She looked past him at the wife and at the baby and at the country stretching out behind them in the long, pale folds it had stretched in for 10,000 years. And she remembered in a small, private way the morning she had first ridden up over that same ridge with an old gray mare and a wagon and a trunk full of maps she had not yet learned to read. "This is the place," she said, and her voice was quiet and clear and carried the weight of all she had learned. "My father did not leave me land, sir. He taught me how to listen for it. Come on down. We will draw you water." She walked with the young man to the well, and she lifted the cover, and she lowered the bucket, and the bucket came up brimming with water, so cold and clear that the morning light passed through it and broke into small, bright pieces against the inside of the pale sandstone. Behind her on the porch, the old gray mare lifted her head from the spring grass. Beyond the cabin, the country opened out under a sky that had been washed by the rains of winter and the first green of spring. Somewhere east of the Bitterroot, a small herd of cattle moved slow across a hillside that had been bone dry a year before, and now ran with the small, clear water of a dozen new irrigation ditches that ran out from a common ditch that ran out from the well at her feet. The valley was alive. The valley was alive in a way no man living had ever seen it. And on a long covered porch in town 3 days a week, a tall man in a gray wool coat sat with a ledger on his knees and met with the small ranchers and the small farmers who had come in for their share of the season's water, and he wrote down what each man took and what each man owed in return, not in gold, but in labor and in promise. And he signed his name to each entry, Beaumont Drexler, trustee. He had ridden every fence line from the dry wash to the Bitterroot in the autumn. He had sat at every table. He had spoken to every man. He had built alongside the woman whose father he had buried with his silence the small, careful system of trust that was now running cold, clear water out into the country. The young man took the bucket from the woman's hands. He drank. His eyes closed. When he opened them again, they were wet at the corners, and he could not for a moment find his voice.
"Ma'am,"
he said,
"what do I owe you for this?"
She smiled again. "You owe me nothing," she said. "You owe the valley what you can give it.
There is a man in Coyote Bend named Drexler who will tell you what that is. Go and see him when you have rested. He will treat you fair."
She helped him fill the small barrel in his wagon. She lifted a tin cup of water to the young wife on the wagon seat, and the wife drank and passed the cup to her child, and the child drank with the slow, grave concentration of a small creature being given a gift it could not yet name. The husband climbed back onto the wagon. He took up the reins. He looked down at the woman in the dark dress at the side of the road.
"What is your name, ma'am?"
"Holloway. Marin Holloway."
"I will tell my children your name, Miss Holloway, when they are old enough to understand."
"You tell them," she said, "that the land had a voice, and that there was a man named Cassius who taught his daughter how to listen for it. That is the story. The rest is only weather." He nodded slowly. He touched the brim of his hat. He clucked his tongue at his team, and the wagon moved on north and west toward the town, where a tall, gray-coated man waited with his ledger, and the young husband and wife and child crested the low ridge above Holloway Spring, and the wagon dropped out of sight. Marin stood for a long while in the road. She watched the dust of the wagon settle behind the ridge. She turned and walked back up the path to the cabin. She climbed the porch steps and sat down in the chair and took up the harness leather and the needle and the awl, and she began again the slow, careful mending. The morning sun moved across her shoulders. The old gray mare grazed on the spring grass behind the corral fence. The water in the well behind the cabin, which had slept 10,000 years beneath a stone, moved cold and clear and patient through the dark veins of the country, out into the small ditches, out into the small, thirsty pieces of land that had never been thirsty all summer, the way a great gift moves through a country that has at last learned how to receive it. Her father had not left her dust. He had left her a language. And in the long, bright morning of the spring of 1890, in the valley that would soon stop calling itself by the name of a creek and start calling itself by the name of a spring, Marin Holloway sat on her porch with a piece of leather in her lap, fluent at last.